Today, we are going to be talking about the movie Dune Part II. Dune, for those who don't know, is based on a series that goes by the same name by the author Frank Herbert. It is a pretty big world, and it is a series that I have read the first two books of, and I quite liked the first book. I totally understand why it gets the hype that it gets. I totally understand why people love it as much as they do. I really enjoyed it. I wouldn't say it was like my favourite sci-fi book that I've ever read, but I did have fun with it. For me, where Frank Herbert really shines in this series, at least so far, like I said, I've only read the first two books, is Dune Messiah. Dune Messiah is one of the best sci-fi books, one of the best books I've read of all time. It is incredible. It's very introspective, and I love everything about it. I only wish it had been longer because the themes and the characterizations that we get in that book are absolutely perfection. So as you can probably tell, I am a pretty big fan of the world, and I'm very excited to continue on reading the series. So when the movie was announced a few years ago, and especially the fact that Denis Villeneuve was attached to it, I was very excited. I love sci-fi movies. It is one of my favorite genres. I think over the last 10-20 years, we've been seeing really high quality sci-fi movies come out. And so I was very excited to see, especially with the advances in movie making and technology, how Denis Villeneuve was going to approach this project, because obviously this world is so huge. So you might be wondering, why do I care about this random person's opinion on the internet? You don't really need to care. This is purely just for entertainment. This is purely just from somebody who is a fan, but not necessarily a super fan of this series, at least so far. But I'm also not indifferent. I would say I'm more on the side of being a fan than not a fan. I quite like what I've read so far, and I also really like Denis Villeneuve as a director. I think he's phenomenal. I've really enjoyed pretty much everything that I've watched of his so far. So when the movie was announced, I did come into this with pretty moderate expectations, having had some experience with the book series, but then also knowing that Denis Villeneuve was attached to it. When I watched the first movie, which I did watch the first time in IMAX and the second time I watched at home, I was pretty excited, but I was also a little bit wary because the Dune world is so vast and there's so much politics, there's so much happening in this world with each of our individual characters that I wasn't sure if anyone was really going to be able to do justice to it. But knowing Denis' previous work, I thought maybe he could do it. So let's go on to briefly what I thought about the first movie. I'm not going to talk about that at length in this video, just because it's been a while since I watched it, and I want to talk about the second movie because I would say I had much more complicated thoughts about it. But the first movie, I liked it. I think it was too long, very long as a matter of fact. I don't think it needs to be like a 2.5 movie in order to be able to get through the first half of the book. It felt very slow. I'm somebody who likes slow burns. I don't need a lot of action in the movies that I watch and the books that I read. In fact, actually the antithesis. I enjoy a slow burn. I enjoy it when things take their time and reveal themselves over time. So for the fact that even I found it a bit slow is saying something. I thought it was really beautifully shot. I thought the music was really good. I thought that the initial characterizations were fairly solid. I did have some issues with the acting, which I'll come onto later on as I talk about part 2. But overall, I would say it was a solid movie. I enjoyed it to the point that I watched it twice. I was very much anticipating part 2 because obviously it is the second part of the first book. So with that in mind, let's move on to what I liked about this movie, and then I will then naturally move on to what I didn't like about this movie and certain creative decisions that were made. A disclaimer that I will say probably at the start of every single video: this is my subjective opinion. If you liked it, good for you. If you didn't, good for you. This is meant to be a space where we can all talk about the things that we love, the different types of media that we love. We all have a subjective opinion on that. So this is purely just my own thoughts. But with that disclaimer out of the way, let's move into my thoughts. So the first thing that I think that has to be recognized is the fact that this is a very beautifully shot movie. It is stunning. And I think when you watch it in IMAX, which is what I did for part 2 as well as part 1, you really get a sense of the scale and the scope of the world, specifically Arrakis, given that's the majority of where we spend the movie. Even though, it's in a desert where the setting and the location is pretty static. Let's say you have a movie in New York, there's a lot of different things and different points of interest to look at. That even though the setting doesn't really change that much, because of the way that the movie is shot, it looks alive. alive. The Sanjus look alive. They almost are like a character in themselves. And I think when he does those really beautiful wide spanning shots where we really get a sense of how big this world is, it's really, really quite breathtaking. And I think that is continues to be one of my favorite things about Villeneuve is that he is extraordinarily talented at making a place feel a lot bigger than it actually is and make it feel a lot grander than it actually is. I vaguely remember from the books, Arrakis is a pretty big planet, but obviously you can't really tell that because every place kind of looks similar, if that makes sense. Despite that, I think Villeneuve does a really good job of capturing the grandeur of the setting and really giving it life. Next, what did I like about it? Unfortunately, that was it. That was it. So now let's move on to what I don't think was that great. And again, these are all my own subjective opinions. This is just a few bullet points that I listed down after I watched the movie. And yeah, let's just jump in. So the first thing that I really struggled with in this movie, and I did feel some of this in part one, I think it really came out in this part, is the characters. Now, one of my favorite things about the books, and I will reference the books as I go throughout this video, one of my favorite things about the books is that we really get a sense of each of our main characters, even the side characters. We really get a sense of who they are, why they're doing what they're doing, where they're going, and what their kind of inner thoughts are as they're going through that journey. We really do get that to quite an astonishing level of depth in the books that we completely miss from the movies. I think this is partly because of the writing of the script, and I think this is probably more largely because of the actors that they chose for these movies. So as an example, let's talk about our main character, Paul Atreides, who is the fucking Messiah. Like, he is the chosen one. He is the one who is going to lead the freemen to freedom. And yet I never really felt like Paul was really the one who this story was centering around. We know it because people say it all the time, but I don't think that the character in this movie, the way that it's written and the way that it's portrayed, really embodies that. I didn't buy it, and I was actually doubting it multiple times, despite the fact that I have read book 1 and book 2, so I know what happens next. I just felt a very large disconnect from him and also the other characters, because they're almost like caricatures of themselves. Editing Zara here, one thing I forgot to mention, but I think is very important to note, is the fact that Paul's character is compelling because in many ways he's portrayed to us as a hero, but in other ways he is portrayed to us as a villain. And that is the dilemma that we as the reader face, the question around whether Paul is actually a hero or whether he is actually a villain. My issue with this series so far, and particularly part 2, is that the character comes across as very one note, and we don't really get a 360 view of his character to really show the nuance of his personality and the way that he handles both situations with the Freeman, but also with the greater political landscape. I think we will get some of that in part 3, and I'm looking forward to see how that plays out. But really, we should have been introduced to that a lot more in this part, because this is where we start to doubt his character, and we start to question whether he is the great leader that the prophecy said he would be. I do largely believe that was because of the way that the script writing was done. I also think a large part of it was because the actors who were selected to play these roles do not have the on-screen presence and gravitas to be able to pull off roles of this magnitude. These characters, whether it's Paul, whether it's Chani, whether it's Irulan, I mean, she's not in this movie that much, but she still plays quite a big role in it. Regardless, my point is that these actors don't have the on-screen presence to be able to pull off characters that play such big roles in the shaping of an entire people. And I think that's the thing I was probably most disappointed about. I think when the cast was initially announced, I was a little bit indifferent, I guess, because I think the main actors, Timothée Chalamet, Zendaya, Florence Pugh, like, I think they're all the up-and-coming actors of the moment, and so they were picked for the fact that they represent the kind of younger generation coming up, right? Which I understand. I get why you would do that. But at the same time, I think it would have been a really great opportunity to really showcase some incredible talent. I think a future video that I'd really like to do is doing my own casting of these movies, because I think it requires a very specific amount of dedication in order to be able to pull off these roles that I don't know if our current cast of actors did commit. I also believe Timothée Chalamet actually did read the book, at least the first one, for preparing for the role. I don't know if the others did that, and I do think that makes a massive difference. I think with him, I don't know if it necessarily helped him portray the role better or worse, but I do think some of the other actors had admitted that they hadn't read the book, and I do think that also showed and potentially made their portrayal even worse. So as an example, Rebecca Ferguson admitted that she did not bother reading the books. She plays Rebecca Atreides, Paul Atreides' mum, and I do think that came across in her performance. But I think these sorts of roles require a lot from the actors. And then I think when you combine that with the fact that I don't think any of these actors particularly had the on-screen presence to pull off roles like Paul and Chani, when you combine those two things together, it's unsurprising that the performances were a little bit lackluster. As an extension of my overall thoughts on the characterization, I do also actually want to talk about Chani's character. I think Chani's character and the direction that her character is going in is not one that I like, and it is different from the book. So in the book, from what I remember, because I haven't read the first book in a while, so please do feel free to correct me down below. But from what I remember, Chani's character, she's got a lot of strength, but she doesn't have necessarily the strength that by modern Western standards we praise, which is that she becomes, in the book, very dedicated to Paul, and she accepts that she has a very specific role to play, and that's not necessarily the role, again, by modern standards, that we would want to portray in a movie of this scale and size. I find that to be very annoying, to be completely honest, because I love the fact that Chani essentially becomes the right hand to Paul in many ways, and even though her and Paul never get married, there is a dedication to Paul that transcends marriage and that transcends a traditional relationship that we see by today's standard. I don't like the fact that she also becomes very suspicious of Paul in the movie. Again, I think in the book she fully understands the role that Paul is going to play, and I think she accepts that she's not going to necessarily get everything that she wants out of that. But she comes to terms with that, and I think that gets a lot of respect from the audience, myself included. And we just don't get that in the movie. In the movie, she kind of almost becomes like this rebel. She's very much anti-Paul being the Messiah. That bit I can understand because, you know, there's this whole idea of the white savior coming to free the natives of a very specific land, which I get that. But I don't like the fact that her character becomes very one-dimensional as a result of the change in her characterization from the book. It also comes across as very cheesy in the movie, the fact that she, by the end of the movie, she is separating away from Paul. Paul essentially proposes that Arulan will become his wife, which is exactly what happens in the books as well. Chani, again, she kind of, she's not super happy about it, but she kind of accepts it because she understands that it has to be done for political maneuvering reasons. And in the book Dune Messiah, we actually get some of her inner thoughts around that, and I think it was really beautifully captured. But unfortunately, by today's Western modern standards, that doesn't seem to fly. And I think that's what I find most annoying about it, is that I think women can have strength in other ways. And yes, I do, again, get the criticism about, her being kind of like the mistress and then Arulan being the wife and them two kind of going against each other. Like, I get it. I get that trope isn't a favourite of a lot of people. But I think, remember the context and the time that this book was written in. I think it would have done a lot more for Chani's characterization if Villeneuve had decided to stick to the original characterization of Chani. I think it makes her a lot more interesting, the way she is done in the books compared to in the movies, because in the movies she's just now going down this path of being a bit of a rebel, comes across as quite immature, to be completely honest, and I don't like that infantilization of this particular storyline. Again, I do understand why they wanted to perhaps modernize the story, but I think, if you're going to stick to the book as much as they did for the first part and to some extent the second part, I think ruining Chani's character didn't have to happen. I think you could portray other forms of strength that this woman has that aren't tied to her being salty about the fact that Paul is getting married to somebody else, essentially. I say this because it's at this point in the movie, when the proposal happens, that Chani leaves the situation and doesn't turn back. I think that's probably going to be an unpopular opinion. I don't know. I think people who maybe have read the books are probably going to agree with me. I don't know, let me know down below if you do or you don't. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts. But I think maybe people who haven't read the books and haven't had the experience of Chani's character in books 1 and 2 maybe will disagree with me. And yeah, I'm just very curious to hear what people think, especially those who have read the books, because I think we have an attachment to Chani that just doesn't come through in the movies. And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that we see this incredible woman sacrifice a lot for the greater cause of not only her and Paul, but also the Fremen in general. And I think that's just not captured at all in this movie. I think the only actor that actually did half well was Javier Bardem, who plays Stilgar. I think his scenes were probably the best ones because you really see him buy into Paul being the Messiah. His scenes were the only ones that I was actually interested in watching because he actually has a lot of the dialogue as well. And you actually see how he changes from part 1 to part 2, and you really see him become almost like a fanatic, almost like he's absolutely obsessed with Paul and what his ascendance essentially brings. And we just don't get that level of attachment, I think, to any of the other characters in this film. So I'm going to stop talking about characters now. I feel like I've spent quite a lot on characters and dialogue, but I do think those were my 2 biggest gripes. One thing that's connected to, I think, what we can only classify as poor characterization is the dialogue. Now, I mentioned the script writing a little bit earlier on, but I think the dialogue in this movie was very minimal. And I like the idea of having minimal dialogue, but I think in this sort of movie where there's a lot of politics, and it's really centering around these characters, I think you need to have dialogue in order to be able to show their individual growth, but then also the broader politics at play. We didn't have much dialogue in this movie. I don't really get why. From what I understand, I believe Denis Villeneuve said in an interview that he really wanted to create a silent movie at some point in his career. I think this is maybe him testing some of that out in this movie. Like, it's not completely silent, of course, there is dialogue, but the dialogue is very minimal. And I personally did not like that. The reason why I didn't like it is because I do think it impacts our view of the character's growth throughout part 1, and particularly in part 2. And more importantly, I think it impacts the overall scope of the broader world, not just Arrakis, but the broader world that exists beyond Arrakis. We really do not get a sense of what is happening aside from with the Harkonnens. But in the books, there are multiple like family houses. There's a lot of backstabbing and machinations happening in the background that we get a lot of. We do not get any of that in this movie. We get one mention of the houses being unhappy about the fact that Paul attacked the Harkonnens when they're on Arrakis. We get one mention of them not being happy about the fact that he wants to, essentially, that he is going to start a holy war. And that is it. That is all we get. That's all we get. That they don't want to support it, and that's it. And that, to me, is just such a waste of the incredible amount of depth that we get to this world in the books, and we just do not get any of it. Considering part 1 was 2.5 hours, part 2 was 2 hours and 45 minutes, it's insane to me that we don't get a sense of all of the other houses at play. And I think that was a really wasted opportunity. I think maybe that's partly down to the fact that Villeneuve maybe wanted to simplify the story. If you're going to create a sci-fi epic with the amount of budget that this movie had, I personally think that's quite lazy. I really think in order for this film to feel as grand as the books, it really needed to have the politics that is laid out in the books. And the other thing is that serves as a reflection of the politics of the time as well. Like, bear in mind, Frank Herbert was writing in the 60s, lots of political strife post-World War II, and many other things happening in the world at the time. I just don't think we get any sense of that, and I think that's so unfortunate, because the things that make these books so special and this world so special is that we get the introspection from the characters, but then we get this broader macro view of the world, and those two things contrasting about how those individual characters are making decisions in this broader context and how that impacts the broader context, and we just do not get any of that. We don't get any of it through dialogue. We don't get any of it through any other form of storytelling. And I think that is really unfortunate. And I think that's one of the things that I found most frustrating about this movie. The last half of the movie as well feels very rushed. I think the lead up to the war bit was just not done very well. I think it needed to be drawn out a little bit more, which is funny because I'm saying this movie was very long and it didn't need to be this long. But I think the pacing overall was pretty off. You know, it starts off very, very, very slow. and then it just ramps up really quickly to the holy war at the end. And I didn't like that decision. I didn't like that creative decision. I think there should have been a bit more of a build up. I think part one should have been a lot better in terms of it pacing, in terms of seeing Paul grow a lot more and seeing Charlie a lot earlier on in the movie. And then I think part two really should have focused on the build up to the war and then the war actually happening. And then part three will naturally be the aftermath of that and the decisions that have been made. Again, I can kind of understand why he did it the way that he did it. I just don't think it worked. I don't think it translated on the screen, and I don't like the way that he's captured the story overall, because it feels very disjointed. I mentioned the final battle just briefly, and let's talk about that a little bit more. I think the final battle was very boring, partly because there was no build up, but also because I don't think we really get like a massive epic battle. Like we do to some extent. We see a lot of different characters running around. There's a large number of people. Like the scale, you see the scale, and yet it didn't feel like a huge battle for me. And I think it's partly because of the pacing being off, but I also think it's just because the characters can't carry the scenes that are required to make that particular part of the movie feel the level of grandness that one would expect in a huge battle scene. It was just very disappointing. It felt very lackluster. It felt like it was over way too quickly as well. And I just feel like it wasn't given the time and attention that it deserved, because I think that could have been an incredibly epic scene. You know, I still remember some of the kind of big battle scenes in Lord of the Rings. I still remember like the big battle scene in The Last Samurai. Like there's certain scenes that you will always remember in movies where, you know, there's kind of big war aspects to it. And I just don't think I will ever really remember the scene, just because it didn't really have any depth to it. It didn't really have any build up, and the characters couldn't carry the weight of the scene. So the dialogue felt very weak. I think there was a lot of emptiness to the words. And I often felt that the character interactions just felt very one-dimensional and didn't really carry any weight. Maybe one or two other things that I will mention is I really did not like the sound design in this movie. Horns. Why so many horns? Horns every single minute, every single second. It was bizarre and I didn't like it. I think the balance was right in part one, but there is horns going off all the time in this movie, and it is annoying. So annoying, especially because there's not much music in this movie. So the predominant sound that you're hearing is horns, and it's just annoying. Please, I beg of you, Denis Villeneuve, do not do that in part three. We don't need it. Please. Easy on the horns. Let's pare it back by about 50%. And then lastly, I think I'm just going to talk about the overall tone. I think, you know, the books are very serious in tone. There isn't much humor, and I think that's good. I think in this movie, they tried to introduce a little bit of light humour, maybe to make it more relevant to modern audiences. I don't know what the creative decision was behind that, but I found it to not really add to the story. You know, you have to remember this world is, you know, we're essentially following the ascension of the Messiah. And while I understand the desire to counteract some of the more serious moments with light humour, I think that humour also needs to match the characters and what is happening. And I felt like there was quite a big mismatch quite a few of the times, and it just again made me feel very disconnected to the overall story and the characters. Some of the humour also felt a bit modern, and again, this series isn't set in modern times, you know, it's set in a futuristic world. So I would assume that the humour would probably be a little bit different. Maybe this is just me nitpicking, but I definitely felt quite a strong disconnect to the humour because it didn't match the setting and the overall serious tone of the movie. So overall, when I came out of this movie, I felt very disappointed and I wanted my money back. Like genuinely, I wanted my money back. I wanted my time back too. 2 hours and 45 minutes is not a short amount of time. And I felt like this movie just lacked a lot of depth. I think the characters lacked a lot of depth. I think the pacing was completely off. The tone was not captured in the way that it is written in the books. And while I'm all for directors having creative freedom, I think when you are adapting something that is so beloved and that is so kind of quintessential to the sci-fi genre, I think you should also respect that material. And I don't think that was necessarily done all the time, especially as it relates to Chani's characterization. That was one of my biggest gripes, was her characterization, the way that it was written, but then also the way that the role was acted. I think the actor doesn't have the level of range to pull off Chani's characterization, because there's so many layers to Chani. And I think in this movie, she's shown to be very one-dimensional, when in matter of fact, she is not one-dimensional at all. There's just so many layers and depth to her that we just did not capture in this. I think it's very beautifully shot, but at the same time, I think the sound was way off. I think it would have been great to have a bit more imagination with the sound design, because like I said, it was very one note and just did not really capture the imagination. So I'm not sure if I'm going to do ratings for movies as I talk about them and kind of reflect on them, but this for me was, you know, below average. I expected more from Denis Villeneuve, especially after Part 1, and more especially because of his other movies that I've absolutely loved more than Dune, but it just felt very flat. This whole world felt very flat. Like, if I had to use one word to describe Part 1 and especially Part 2, it would be flat. Like, I didn't feel any sense of emotion coming out of this movie. I didn't feel, you know, elated. I didn't feel happy, sad, I just felt annoyed, which is an emotion obviously, but it's not the emotion one would expect to get after watching Dune, especially after reading the books. So anyway, let's leave it there. I think I've given enough of my thoughts on this movie. I'm very curious to hear what you think. As I said, this is my subjective experience, and you know, your experience might be different, and I'm very excited to hear that. I'm also excited to hear if you had a similar experience to me, so let me know down below in the comments. I'll see you there. Thanks for watching. Please give us a subscribe if you like this video. I will be doing more film reviews, TV show reviews, also video game reviews. So if you're interested in that, please do consider subscribing and liking this video. I also do have a book review channel called Books with Zara. I will also link that down below if you're interested in hearing my thoughts on various books that I read. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Stay safe, everybody. Take care, and I will see you soon. Bye.